The skies above the tranquil planet of Liridian erupted in violent streaks of fiery descent. Metallic titans, their hulls emblazoned with the sigils of countless conquered worlds, tore through the atmosphere like angry gods. The Galactic Dominion had arrived. At the heart of Liridian's capital, Arius, a city of gleaming spires and cascading gardens, panic spread like wildfire. People fled to the safety of underground shelters, their faces pale with dread. Yet, amidst the chaos, Captain Cale Veros stood unmoved on the observation deck of the Aegis Tower, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the descending fleet. How long until they make planetfall? Cale's voice was steady, a stark contrast to the quaking lieutenant at his side. 15 minutes, sir, stammered Lieutenant Lyra Solon, her hands clutching a tablet that displayed grim data streams. Their forces outnumber us 10-1. Resistance is not futile, Cale interrupted. His voice carried a weight that silenced Lyra's doubts. We don't fight because we can win. We fight because surrender is a worse fate. Lyra nodded, swallowing her fear. She had followed Cale for years, through skirmishes on distant moons and battles in asteroid fields, and his resolve had never faltered. He was a symbol, not just for Liridian, but for the resistance that dared to defy the Galactic Dominion. Cale turned his gaze to the holographic map projected before him. The Dominion's forces were already establishing a perimeter, their massive troop carriers touching down with seismic force. Yet Cale's focus wasn't on the overwhelming numbers. It was on a single red dot moving independently from the others. They've sent him, Cale muttered, his jaw tightening. Who? Lyra asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. General Archon Voss, Cale replied. The Dominion's hammer. He's here to make an example of us. Lyra's blood ran cold. Voss was a name whispered with equal parts terror and reverence across the galaxy. A man who left only ashes in his wake, his arrival signified more than conquest. It meant obliteration. The Aegis Tower trembled as distant explosions rippled through the city. The Dominion's ground forces were advancing, their monstrous war machines carving through Liridian's defenses. Cale's fingers danced over the console, sending orders to the scattered remnants of the planetary militia. Activate the anti-air batteries, he commanded, and get me a secure line to Commander Riva. Riva Torin was the leader of the Shadow Blades, an elite guerrilla unit hidden in the dense forests beyond the city. If anyone could turn the tide, it was her. Lyra hesitated. Sir, if we reveal Riva's position, they'll find her anyway, Cale said, cutting her off. Better she strikes first. As the orders were relayed, Cale allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had always known this day would come. For years, Liridian had been a beacon of defiance, a stubborn thorn in the Dominion's side. Their refusal to kneel had made them a target, and now the price of that defiance was due. On the outskirts of Arius, in a hidden bunker, Riva Torin studied the Dominion's movements through a tactical display. Her dark eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, scanned the data with relentless precision. Her team, a ragged but deadly mix of sharpshooters, engineers, and saboteurs, stood ready. When Cale's face appeared on the comm screen, Riva offered a grim smile. Captain, I was wondering when you'd call. Riva, we need to hit their supply lines before they can fortify, Cale said without preamble. Can you make it happen? Riva's grin widened. Consider it done. We'll give them a welcome they won't forget. As the line cut off, Riva turned to her team. You heard the man. Let's remind the Dominion why the Shadow Blades have a bounty bigger than some planets. Her team erupted in grim chuckles, their spirits bolstered by the promise of action. Meanwhile, aboard the Dominion flagship Erebus, General Archon Voss watched the unfolding invasion with dispassionate eyes. A mountain of a man, his presence dominated the command deck. Clad in black armor that gleamed like obsidian, he radiated an aura of unassailable authority. Report, Voss demanded, his voice a low rumble that carried across the deck. Resistance is sporadic, replied a junior officer. Their defenses are crumbling, but there's a guerrilla force in the forests. They've already taken out 3 supply convoys. Voss's lips curled into a faint smile. Good. I prefer prey that fights back. The officer hesitated. Sir, should we redirect? No, Voss interrupted. Let them think they have the advantage. We'll crush them when they show their hand. Voss's gaze shifted to the planet below. He knew Calveros was down there. The captain's reputation had reached even the Dominion's ears, a leader who inspired loyalty in the face of hopeless odds. Voss relished the thought of breaking him. As night fell over Luridian, the battle intensified. The Shadow Blade struck with surgical precision, ambushing Dominion patrols and sabotaging key installations. In the city, Kale coordinated the militia, turning every street and alley into a potential death trap for the invaders. But the Dominion was relentless. Their advanced technology and sheer numbers began to wear down Luridian's defenders. The once proud city of Arius was a battleground, its pristine streets scarred by fire and blood. In the midst of the chaos, Kale found himself face-to-face with the enemy. A Dominion squad had breached the command center, their plasma rifles glowing ominously. Kale drew his blade, a weapon of ancient craftsmanship passed down through generations of Luridian warriors. Captain Veros, the Dominion sergeant, sneered. Your resistance is admirable, but pointless. Kale didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The sergeant fell, and the room erupted into chaos. Lyra, armed with a compact blaster, took down another soldier, her earlier fear replaced by determination. Together, she and Kale fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Far above, Voss observed the dwindling resistance. He tapped a command into his console, activating a transmission. Veros, he said, his voice echoing across all frequencies. Kale froze as Voss's voice filled the room. You fight well, the general said, almost admiringly. But this is over. Surrender now, and I may spare what's left of your people. Kale gritted his teeth. Luridian doesn't kneel. So be it, Voss replied, cutting the transmission. The flagship Erebus shifted position, its massive cannons aligning with the planet's surface. Kale's heart sank as he realized what was about to happen. Lyra, he said quietly, evacuate the shelters. Now. But, sir, do it, he barked, his voice brooking no argument. As Lyra scrambled to relay the order, Kale looked to the sky, his mind racing. He had prepared for many scenarios, but the annihilation of his world wasn't one he could bear. In the forests, Riva and her team intercepted the new orders. Her eyes widened as she grasped the gravity of the situation. If we don't take out that flagship, there won't be a Luridian left to save. We don't have the firepower for that, one of her team members argued. Riva's gaze hardened. Then we'll find another way. Here's a crafted, excerpted hearing to your specifications. The sun dipped low, its golden light glinting off the battered armor of the Tidemark, a relic from a war no one wanted to remember. To the untrained eye, it was just another decommissioned tank left to rust in the yard outside Beller's workshop. To Alex Karen, it was a puzzle, a labyrinth of lost potential. Alex crouched beside the tank, her hands smeared with grease and her dark, tightly braided hair falling loose from the band she'd tied it with that morning. She wiped her brow and glanced at her younger brother, Eli, who sat cross-legged on the ground, fiddling with the exposed circuitry from the Tidemark's gutted console. It doesn't add up, Alex muttered. The schematics say this thing could run off 10% of the power we're feeding it now. In this, she tapped a section of the hull. This plating isn't standard issue. It's reinforced, but why? Eli looked up, his hazel eyes glinting with the same mix of curiosity and defiance that had gotten them both expelled from two separate colonies. Maybe it's not what they said it was, he suggested. What if the Tidemark wasn't a failure? What if someone made it fail? Alex froze. The thought unsettled her, not because it was far-fetched, but because it wasn't. They'd been scavengers long enough to know that history was written by whoever held the strongest weapon, and secrets like these had a way of drawing attention. You think it's worth the risk? She asked. Eli shrugged. When isn't it? Before she could respond, a low whistle cut through the yard. Both siblings tensed, exchanging a glance. Alex reached for the wrench by her side, her fingers tightening around its cool steel grip as a shadow fell across the tide mark. You two always did have a knack for finding trouble. Alex turned slowly to face the newcomer. Standing at the edge of the yard was a man dressed in a patched military coat, his boots caked with the red dust that marked him as a drifter. His face was sharp, angular, but it was his eyes, piercing, calculating, that set Alex on edge. "Lieutenant Vance," she said evenly, though her pulse quickened. "Didn't think we'd see you again." Vance's smirk was as sharp as a blade. "I didn't think I'd be back either. But then I heard rumors about a couple of kids poking around where they shouldn't." His gaze shifted to the tide mark. "Funny, isn't it? This old thing was supposed to be dismantled years ago." Eli stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "We bought it fair and square," he said. "Doesn't matter what it used to be, doesn't it?" Vance stepped closer, his tone still casual, but his stance radiating authority. "The tide mark isn't just a tank. It's a key, a relic of a program so classified most people still think it's a myth. If you've figured out even a fraction of what it can do, you've got every faction in the quadrant gunning for you." Alex stepped between Vance and her brother. "We're not looking for trouble," she said. "We just wanted to understand how it worked." "That's the problem," Vance said. "Understanding leads to questions. And questions, well, they make people nervous." Alex's grip on the wrench tightened. "What do you want, Vance?" The lieutenant's smirk faded. "To offer you a choice. Walk away now, and I'll make sure no one else comes looking for you. Or, you help me finish what the tide mark started." Eli snorted. "Finish what?" "Whatever this thing was built for, it didn't work." "You're wrong," Vance said quietly. "The tide mark worked exactly as intended. That's why they buried it." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the workshop's generator. Alex exchanged a glance with Eli, who looked as uneasy as she felt. Trusting Vance was a gamble, but so was turning him away. "Say we help you," Alex said finally. "What happens when we're done?" Vance's eyes darkened. "That depends on who gets there first, and how far you're willing to go to stop them." The weight of his words settled over them like a storm cloud. Alex turned back to the tide mark, her mind racing. For years, they'd scraped by on the edges of conflict, scavenging what others left behind. But this was different. The tide mark wasn't just a piece of history, it was a weapon. And weapons, Alex knew, always came with a cost. "I need time to think," she said at last. Vance nodded. "You've got until sunrise. After that, this offer's off the table." He turned and walked away, his silhouette vanishing into the twilight. Alex let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and glanced at Eli. "What do you think?" she asked. Eli shrugged. "I think he's trouble. But if the tide mark really is what he says it is," he trailed off, his expression hard to read. Alex looked at the tank again, her thoughts a tangle of doubt and determination. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear. The tide mark was no longer just a relic. It was a decision, a turning point, and it was up to her to decide which path to take. The section ends with a strong sense of foreboding and an open question, encouraging readers to continue exploring the story. Here's the requested excerpt, focusing on clarity, vividness, and narrative drive. The final stand. The world was ending, and General Adrian Kovacs felt the weight of every decision she had ever made pressing against her chest. The air in the underground command bunker was cold, yet sweat clung to her temples. All around her, holographic screens buzzed with red alerts, mapping the steady advance of the Shadow Swarm. 3 hours until they breached the perimeter, Lieutenant Roel Sandoval said, his voice hoarse but steady. He was young, barely 30, and yet the deep lines around his eyes told of someone who had already lived a lifetime of war. Adrienne's jaw tightened. "What about the evac shuttles?" "They've lifted off," Roel replied. "Civilians are clear. All that's left is us." The general nodded. All that was left indeed. Humanity's last stand was a crumbling fortress in the Nevada desert, its once formidable walls now pockmarked with scars from countless battles. Adrian turned to the central holomap, watching the swarm's dark tendrils spread like ink through the terrain. They weren't creatures in the traditional sense. more a mass of biomechanical horrors driven by an alien will. Their singular goal, extinction. Adrienne's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Activate the Nova shield. The room went silent. Captain Alara Vance, a tactical officer with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, stepped forward. Ma'am, if we activate the shield, we'll be locking ourselves in. There'll be no retreat. We're not retreating, Adrienne said, her voice ironclad. We hold this line or there's nothing left for humanity to rebuild. Alara hesitated but gave a curt nod. Yes, ma'am. She turned to her console, fingers flying over the keys. A low hum filled the room as the Nova shield powered up, encasing the bunker in a shimmering energy barrier. The shield bought them time, but not much. Adrienne knew the swarm would adapt. It always did. That was the terrifying thing about their enemy. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was a mind, vast and unknowable, with intelligence far beyond their own. The door to the bunker hissed open, and Dr. Ethan Cade strode in, clutching a tablet. He was a civilian scientist, but his work on neural disruptors had proven invaluable. His usually disheveled appearance was even more chaotic, his lab coat streaked with grease and soot. I have something, he announced, drawing every eye in the room. Adrienne turned to him. You'd better, Doctor. We're running out of miracles. Ethan tapped his tablet, projecting a schematic into the air. This is the Mark 7 disruptor. It's a prototype, untested, but it's designed to scramble the swarm's neural network. If we can deploy it at the heart of their hive, it could sever their connection and shut them down. Alara frowned. You're suggesting we march into the middle of that? She gestured to the holomap, where the swarm's advance looked like a tidal wave ready to crash. It's suicide, Roll muttered. Maybe, Ethan admitted, but it's also our only chance. Adrienne stared at the projection. The hive was massive, a pulsating mass of dark metal and organic matter located deep in the swarm's territory. Reaching it would require a small, fast team, sacrificial most likely. I'll go, she said. Roll stepped forward. General, with all due respect. Don't, she cut him off. Her eyes were sharp, resolute. This is my fight. I've spent 20 years leading from the front. I won't stop now. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then Alara spoke, her voice softer than usual. You'll need backup. I'm in. Roll sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Someone has to keep you two out of trouble. I'm coming too. Adrienne glanced at Ethan. You're the only one who knows how this thing works. You're with us? He paled but nodded. Understood. The plan came together quickly. They would take a stealth shuttle, flying low to avoid detection, and infiltrate the hive. Once inside, Ethan would deploy the disruptor while the others held off the swarm. It was desperate, reckless, but it was all they had. The team suited up in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Adrienne donned her battle armor, its surface battered but still gleaming with patches of reinforced alloy. As she strapped on her gauntlets, she glanced at a faded photograph tucked into a pocket on the inside of her chest plate. It showed her younger self, smiling, with a child on her hip, her daughter. She hadn't seen Emma in years, not since the swarm first descended and ripped their world apart. The thought of her daughter, safe on one of the evacuation ships, gave Adrienne the strength she needed. The shuttle ride was turbulent, the desert winds throwing the small craft off course more than once. Ethan sat across from Adrienne, clutching the disruptor like a lifeline. Alara and Roll checked their weapons, a quiet determination etched into their faces. As they neared the hive, the atmosphere grew heavier, darker. The air seemed to buzz with a low-frequency hum that made Adrienne's teeth ache. The hive loomed ahead, a nightmarish structure of spires and tendrils that writhed as if alive. The shuttle touched down, and the team disembarked into a landscape of ash and ruin. The ground squelched beneath their boots, and the air smelled of decay. They moved quickly, weapons at the ready, the disruptor's bulky casing slowing them down. The first wave of the swarm hit them like a storm. Creatures with serrated limbs and glowing red eyes poured from the hive's walls, shrieking in unison. Adrienne's pulse rifle barked, cutting down the first few. But there were always more. Keep moving, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. They pushed forward, a desperate sprint through a gauntlet of death. Roll covered their flank, his grenades lighting up the darkness. Alara fought with precision, each shot finding its mark. Finally, they reached the hive's core, a cavernous chamber filled with pulsating veins of light and shadow. Ethan dropped to his knees, setting up the disruptor while Adrian and the others formed a protective circle around him. "Hurry up!" Alara yelled, blasting a swarm drone out of the air. "I'm going as fast as I can." Ethan snapped, his hands trembling as he connected wires and calibrated settings. The swarm pressed closer, their shrieks deafening. One of them lunged at Adrian, its claws raking across her armor. She grunted, driving her blade into its torso and kicking it away. "Done!" Ethan shouted. "Activating now!" The disruptor emitted a high-pitched whine, then a pulse of blue energy that rippled outward. The effect was immediate. The swarm froze, their bodies convulsing as their network unraveled. Adrian didn't wait to see the aftermath. "Fall back!" They ran, the hive collapsing around them as the disruptor's energy destabilized its structure. The shuttle was barely functional, its engines sputtering as they lifted off, but it held together long enough to get them clear. As they soared back toward the bunker, Adrian looked out the window. The hive was gone, and the swarm with it. For the first time in years, the night sky was quiet. Alara slumped in her seat, exhausted. "Did we just win?" Adrian didn't smile, but there was a softness in her eyes. "We just gave humanity a chance." This section concludes the immediate mission, offering a sense of victory while leaving room for future challenges.